Welcome to Doctor and the Dude. I am Dr. Jim Siebert, and the Dude is my good friend Josh Morgerman. Josh, how are you doing today? Double thumbs up.
Okay, Doc.
I'm going to go with good on that one. Now, it's interesting that if everybody, I want you to look closely at Josh, notice he's wearing a coat, and he's in the South. It's not supposed to be that cold this time of year, Josh. What's going on with that?
I am not cool with it, or I should say this cool. I just got back here. I was in LA last week shooting my TV series Mission Hurricane. Landed in New Orleans last night, got back to Mississippi, and I'm freezing, okay? It's afternoon here. It's in the 50s, okay? Air's got that cold, dry feeling. The idea of a hurricane here, it seems inconceivable. In terms of hurricane season on the Gulf Coast, I'm not making a prediction. I'm saying in my bones, it feels like game over.
Well, you know, the older you get, the worse that feels. Just want you to know that you have something to look forward to. Hey, but you know what's interesting about all this, though? The fact that it's cold right now in the South also is having a big influence on the Gulf of Mexico, and it's kind of like the bottom sort of dropped out of the activity that we've been tracking, at least in the Atlantic Sea basin.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Jim, you talk about this all the time, how those fronts come in and it's just like it's a light switch going off. You know, it's not a gradual thing. You know, all of a sudden it's just like everything changes and you feel like there's this feeling of things just kind of shutting down, which of course, after what happened a few weeks ago on the Gulf Coast, that is welcome news.
And it is interesting now for all of our viewers who are not on the coast, you know, maybe you're in the mountains or in the Northeast or something. It's interesting how your summer's going along, and then we get into September, and then once we get to October, all of a sudden one day you walk outside and it's freezing, and you're like, oh my gosh, summer is gone. Well, that is having a huge influence on the storms and on the influence on the Gulf, of the water temperature for the Gulf, and even on the Atlantic, because now, you know, we're getting less sunlight as far as daylight hours, and then the sunlight's coming in at an angle more because we're now moving, you know, the way we're moving around our orbit around the sun. And so all those things tied in with some cold air spilling out of Canada, it drops those temperatures, and we go from, you know, having the activity with like Fiona and things like that to nothing. And so it's surprising every year, but also, Josh, it doesn't mean that we are completely done yet on the Atlantic side.
Yeah, exactly. And I also want to point out that like our famine is the feast of somewhere else. So I always think of the Atlantic and Pacific as kind of having an inverse relationship. So those same fronts that are coming into North America and down to the Gulf and basically shutting down the hurricane season here are exactly what creates a bigger threat for the west coast of Mexico. Now, all summer long, hurricanes form in the eastern Pacific, and they just move west harmlessly out to sea. When we get into late October, those cold fronts come down, and they actually scoop those hurricanes up and boomerang them back toward the west coast of Mexico. And this is some pretty hardwired climatology. And what you see is that a lot of the major impacts on the west coast of Mexico, we're talking the big scary category 4s, happen October 20-something. So it's a time when usually things are shutting down in the Atlantic, but those fronts are actually sending those missiles right onto the west coast of Mexico. So it's interesting times. And we have something now, of course, possibly threatening the west coast of Mexico as I speak.
Well, and what's interesting about that, okay, now talk about, you know, tropical season for our friends in, let's say, the southwestern U.S., where you don't really expect hurricanes. Well, there's a high likelihood that whatever happens in Mexico at this time of year will swing and slingshot some extra, and I mean a lot of extra, moisture into the southwest, meaning we could see some very heavy rainfall. So you don't even have to necessarily be right on the coast to still be impacted by hurricane season.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's also interrelated, and the impact of tropical systems, like you said, it goes well beyond the coasts. I mean, so much of the Midwest, you know, and this desert Southwest have gotten record-breaking rainfalls from dying tropical cyclones.
So we will continue to monitor that very closely. So now, as we're moving towards, we're not at the end, but moving in the second half of hurricane season, Josh, let's take a look back and say, and for one important reason, what has been the biggest surprise to you so far for this hurricane season?
I would say for me, it was just, I couldn't get a rhythm going for this season. It was dead, it was dead, it was dead. And then in my mind, I was convinced that the U.S. was going to get off easy this year. And then we had that unbelievable cataclysmic impact on the Gulf Coast. I have to be honest, it was inconceivable to me in early September that we were going to have something like that happen. I should let my guard down, but even as an experienced hurricane hunter, it just shows you just every hurricane season has its sort of surprises, its plot twists. That for me was like the big story of the year, just that this midseason burst out of this dead activity. What about you?
That's actually a really good point about even, we spend our lives, covering this, preparing for this, forecasting these things, and we still remind ourselves, don't let your guard down, because, something could still happen. Now, for me, I know it's going to be a big surprise for you. It's been, again, the African dust, and how every time when we have a hurricane season, the one caveat, the one thing that is the fly in the ointment will be that dust coming off of Africa. And this year, it happened to happen right around July. And so we had a month where nothing happened, when everything just looked like it was going to explode. The models were trying to find something, but they just couldn't account for that dust. And we've seen that happen before in other hurricane seasons. So to me, this year so far, it's been the African dust. Well, Josh, as always, the time flies when you and I get to talk together. So we'll continue to monitor what's going on this hurricane season, but hopefully it stays nice and quiet for everybody. And Josh, you stay safe out there as well. All right, everybody, we'll see you there. We'll see you next time.